This is the story of the Pollock twins, a remarkable tale founded on tragedy and surrounded by so many bizarre and eerie details that it just might be one of the most intriguing stories of reincarnation ever told. It all began in May of 1957 when Joanne and Jacqueline Pollock were on their way to a church service. The girls were being raised as devout Catholics by their parents, John and Florence, and as a result, the family attended the church regularly. However, little did they know that on this particular morning, the girls would never make it to the steps of Hexham Abbey. All because of the actions of one person, a woman named Marjorie Wynne. After a lot of heartbreak and losing custody of her own children, she felt that she no longer had a reason to live. And in a drunken state, she had taken a bottle of pills and then got into her car. Now, upon seeing the Pollock girls, Marjorie was overcome by this anger, this rage, and in a split moment, she decided that since she had lost her daughters, she would inflict that kind of pain onto another family, and she drove her car directly into the girls. The girls died on the scene. Joanna was 11 and Jacqueline was only 6 years old. Now, understandably, this event had a profound impact on the Pollock family, but while Florence tried to avoid thinking about the girls, John really devoted himself to keeping them in his mind. And years later, when recounting the family's story, he shared that on the day of the accident, he believes that he experienced a vision of his daughters in heaven. Over the following weeks, he actually sensed the presence of their spirits in an upper room of the house, and so he took to spending time there in order to be close to them. Although he was a Catholic, he would often describe himself as more of a spiritualist, and he was really very open to all aspects of that world. And so despite his Christian faith, John also believed very strongly in reincarnation. He would pray to God for evidence of reincarnation, and John later said that he felt the girls' deaths had been punishment from God, and so he genuinely believed that his prayers had been answered on October the 4th, 1958, when Florence gave birth to twin daughters, who they named Jillian and Jennifer. From the very first moment that John laid eyes on the twins, Jennifer in particular, he was absolutely certain that his daughters had been returned to him. When Jacqueline was around 3 years old, she had fallen off a tricycle, and the accident had caused a small gash on her forehead over her right eye near the bridge of her nose, and this formed a permanent scar. And Jacqueline also had a round, dark birthmark on the left side of her waist. It just so happened that Jennifer was born with two birthmarks. One that sat over her right eye near the bridge of her nose, and the second was a dark circle on the left side of her waist. So John became absolutely convinced that Joanne and Jacqueline had reincarnated into the family as twins. And Florence completely rejected this belief, but John was insistent. After all, the doctor had predicted that they'd just have a single baby, and this was based on palpitations, fetal heartbeats. There's just no sign of twins. And then when she gives birth, boom, twins. But Florence just would not entertain this idea at all, and she told John that enough was enough. She didn't want to hear it, and she just wanted to move on and focus on the future. And so that's what they did. Well, that's what they tried to do at least, because although John did his best to keep his notions around reincarnation to himself, as the girls grew up, the family began to notice that their behaviours seemed out of sorts. The first example of this was that the girls just seemingly developed an astonishing fear of cars. Like, they were terrified of cars. And then, when the twins were around 3 years old, the parents presented them with toys that had once belonged to their deceased sisters. And Jillian claimed a doll that had belonged to Joanna, and and Jennifer claimed the one that had belonged to Jacqueline. And both of the girls said that these dolls had been gifts from Santa Claus, which was true. They had been given as Christmas gifts to the other girls. And another interesting and somewhat regular occurrence was that from time to time, Florence would overhear Gillian and Jennifer discussing the details of the accident. And on one occasion, she recalled walking in on Gillian, cradling Jennifer's head, saying, "The blood's coming out of your eyes, that's where the car hit you," which is fairly disturbing in itself. Two children just playing make-believe car crashes. That didn't just happen once. It wasn't like this was like, oh, that's kind of weird. That was a weird thing they did one time. No, this happened all the time. Florence would overhear this sort of stuff constantly. But the most bizarre thing about that particular recreation is that when John identified his daughter's bodies, Jacqueline's head had been bandaged above the eyes completely. And perhaps the most intriguing and really kind of convincing or compelling evidence that this points to reincarnation is the fact that the Pollocks moved away from Hexham when the twins were still babies. When the twins were around 4 years old, they decided they would go to Hexham, visit some family, and catch up with some old friends. But as they walked through the town, the twins, at 4 years old, led their parents around, pointing out landmarks and places that their sisters would frequent during their lives. And they even took their parents to a park where Joanne and Jacqueline would often play. Now, today, the Pollock twins stands out as a captivating instance of the unexplained and mysterious. And although the reason behind their behaviour is still unclear, their narrative continues to intrigue the public and fuel interest in the concept of reincarnation. But I think it's really important that we consider the source when it comes to these kind of stories, because as it happens, the only people to really witness any of these instances firsthand were the children's parents, one of whom was completely enthralled by the concept of reincarnation. And I'm not saying at all that the Pollocks are liars, but I just think it's worth considering that perhaps the family, still stricken with the grief of losing two daughters, were maybe seeing signs that weren't necessarily there. For example, I think it's fair to say that you can explain away some of these factors. For example, in terms of knowing that the dolls were for Christmas. Well, most children back then would only get gifts for Christmas, so it does make sense that the girls would assume Santa Claus left these dolls for them. And it would also kind of make sense to me personally that the girls would develop a fear of cars, because if their parents had lost two children to a car accident, it goes without saying that they would educate their future children on the dangers of cars. So this fear could have really been manufactured through the environment in which they grew up subconsciously. Their dad constantly telling them, be careful when you cross the road, make sure you look both ways, because if a car hits you, you'll die. Basically building up this idea, this notion that cars are just killing machines. However, it does get a little bit harder to explain the other behaviours. For example, the reenactment of the car accident, the specifics of that. Was that just some horrific make-believe? How would children in that era know the intimate details of a car accident, especially when they're like 4 years old? Nowadays, with the internet, a kid could easily sit there and watch hours and hours of road traffic accidents. As grim as that is, that's a very real possibility for children today. But we're talking about the 50s and the 60s. It wasn't easily accessible information. The fact that the twins knew their way around a town that they had never visited, that's also very hard to explain. And if we take their word on it and assume it's true, then I have no explanation for that whatsoever. Well, that's it today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I really, really appreciate it. Do let me know what you think about the Pollock twins in the comments. I'd be really interested in hearing some of your opinions. And if you enjoyed it, please go ahead and click like. And if you want to help me grow the channel and support me, you can go ahead and click subscribe. You'll see more content like this, and I really, really appreciate it. So until next time, See ya.